Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and this evening I'm joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Thanks so much for joining me this evening.
Always a pleasure to be joining you and looking forward to the show tonight.
Coming up on the show, British doctors and surgeons working in Gaza have given some powerful testimonies on conditions in the Strip. We have an interview with Mark Blyth, international economics professor and author of Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. And Donald Trump has announced plans for an Iron Dome-style air defense system for the US, dubbed the Golden Dome. One man seems like he could profit incredibly from this plan. See if you can guess who. Stay tuned for all of that. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer doesn't have many talents, but there's one thing he excels at: U-turns. And today in Prime Minister's Questions, he did another one.
I recognise that people are still feeling the pressure of the cost of living crisis, including pensioners. And as the economy improves, we want to make sure people feel those improvements in their days as their lives go forward. And that is why we want to ensure that as we go forward, more pensioners are eligible for winter fuel payments. As you would expect, Mr. Speaker, we will only make decisions we can afford. That is why we will look at that as part of a fiscal event.
We will look at that as part of a fiscal event. Again, inspiring stuff. Of course, that was one of Starmer's better U-turns. So I prefer him to U-turn on this than when he U-turned on, I suppose, nationalising water, for example. But there we are. The cut to winter fuel was announced in July last year, depriving 10 million pensioners in England and Wales of the £300 annual payment. It later emerged that the government announced the cuts without carrying out an assessment into how it would affect poorer pensioners. But in November last year, figures released by Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall showed that the cut would likely drive 100,000 extra pensioners into poverty in just 2 years. Those figures, of course, made the moral case for reversing a policy that was likely to harm some of the country's poorest pensioners. But it's probably not the moral argument that's moved the Prime Minister. Westminster insiders began briefing a U-turn to the cut immediately after Labour's local elections disaster earlier this month, and with the words on the doorstep being that many Labour voters had swung to smaller parties, including Reform, over the policy. And More in Common polling last week showed that a majority of all Britons, as well as both current Labour supporters and those Labour voters who switched during the local elections, would think better of the government if they did a U-turn. Now, exactly how the U-turn will be carried out remains unclear, though. As it stands, only pensioners on pension credit or other means-tested benefits qualify for the winter fuel payment. And that means that only those whose annual income is below £11,500 get it. Now, Starmer has said that more people will be brought into the winter fuel payment fold. But of course, unless it returns to being a universal benefit, where the line is drawn could continue to be very much controversial. Helena, we've seen this coming for a while. This is the first time it's been confirmed by Keir Starmer. Is this a relief?
I mean, it seems like the inevitability from the disastrous local elections that they had, where whilst there has been lots of discussion around migration policy, and that is high up on levels of voters' consent and is close to first place in what More in Common have been putting out in terms of their polls of people's main issues. The thing that really is seen as the original sin, quote unquote, of the Labour government is the cut to winter fuel payment. I think mainly, basically, because pensioners vote. Pensioners have been this kind of massive electoral cohort for basically whoever has won the general elections for the past kind of 45 years or so. And without them, it's very, very difficult to be electorally successful. And you see what happens when these people revolt. Because not only do they vote often in a high propensity. So they turned out a lot of things for things like local elections in the way that young people don't. That's not to say, though, that it's only pensioners who view this specific policy as being bad. Again, going back to More in Common, when they also looked at how young people saw the cuts to winter fuel payment, they also disliked it too. Like, you're not only pissing off with the policy a bunch of the elderly, but also their grandchildren, right? Like, it's very easy to attack in the political sphere. People talking in the media, oh, they're taking money away from your gran. Young people that aren't particularly hot on that kind of stuff. So this U-turn was basically inevitable. I think the reason why we got to this position in the first place is that in the kind of the Labour right kind of orthodoxy of how you approach political campaigning and how you position yourself electorally, they still think it's 2010. They still think that we're in a world where people will understand you as long as you just say difficult decisions have to be made. The previous government made a mess. We have to clean that up, and some of you are going to have to make sacrifices. People are thinking far more zero sum than they were in 2010, right? This idea of like a national project where we all have to pitch in, that's not really something that is amenable to the country in the world we live in now than it was in 2010. And so this Osborneism of expecting people to just accept cuts in different places for fixing the finance or fixing the budget, that doesn't really wash with voters in the way that it did back then. And this orthodoxy is something that really needs beating out of our political class, and that we're living in a new world of zero-sum thinking. There are obviously some fixes, as you say, that could be done to raise the threshold to which people pay. You could raise the level at which people qualify for pension credit. Of course, that would cost the government even more money when ostensibly this was to save money. That's what they said, was it was about fixing the £22 billion black hole. They didn't want to do it, despite Rachel Reeves saying she wanted to do it in 2014. But regardless, right, if you increase whatever level it is, there will always be somebody who's just above the threshold. There will be people who have not claimed pension credit, regardless of where you put that limit. For example, if you did increase the pension credit threshold, and they would also miss out and fall through the cracks because of the lack of universality. This is why means testing is kind of bad in and of itself. There will always be people who fall through the cracks. There will be that cutoff point where it ends up being worse, being a higher earner than not, having a higher income than not, where you just miss out, therefore you get less than somebody in terms of remuneration from the welfare state. And then on top of this, what you could do is just make it universal and have a tax taper. There's a really great article by the economist Matt Bruenig for the People's Policy Project. It's a kind of crowdfunded left-wing think tank, pointing out like how means testing is bad politically, because you create a sense of both entitlement and also a sense of grievance for those who qualify on either side of the line. And broadly, it's bad kind of in terms of utility for the people who might miss out. So actually, means testing is bad, and you should just do tax tapers, and that would actually save the exchequer money and be better politically. The last point I would make, though, is that it's very interesting to me that the benefit that they are cutting, that they might U-turn on, is the one that goes to the sector of the population that's actually richer than most other people. So whilst I disagree with means testing, if you're going to make an argument there should be a U-turn on one of these benefit cuts, the benefit that goes to people who have more consumptive power than most young people do, that seems like a bit of a misstep. Where 20% of pensioners are millionaires, I don't think we should be in a position where if we're going to have to pick and choose between the welfare cuts that we do and don't want to keep, why this is taking precedence over, the disabled, like the cuts to PIP, for example. This is mind-boggling to me. Of course, it makes sense because the disabled people don't have anyone to fight for them, nor are they people who can afford to, buy Keir Starmer's wife some dresses. So they don't have the political power to be able to kind of mobilize an electoral cohort behind them. But if we're actually talking about the brass tacks of the utility here, if we should be pressing the government for anything, if there should be one specific cut that they've done that should be damning for the reality of who this government represents, it's the cuts to PIP, because they are the least able to defend themselves. They're the people who most need that money due to the situations they find themselves in. And the number of people who are going to be put into poverty as a result of that cut is more than double the number that's going to be hit by the winter fuel payments means test. So I find it pretty upsetting, I guess, that there's been such furore over winter fuel, and yet the PIP cuts is seen as a divisive issue rather than this kind of original sin.
It's interesting. Because obviously under George Osborne, my impression was one of the reasons sort of so much was targeted against the disabled is because they don't have a massive political voice. But there was quite a lot of reporting sort of after the local elections suggesting that the PIP cuts had hurt Labour on the doorstep and that there was quite a lot of pressure on Rachel Reeves to U-turn on it. Obviously not as much pressure, as you say, on the winter fuel payment. But I suppose my hope would be that actually sort of what do I want to call it? Sort of the group of people who receive PIP aren't necessarily as politically weak as the government might have originally sort of accounted for, especially because so many people claim PIP now. There'll be lots of people on it or someone who has a family member. My understanding also was that some of the quirks isn't quite the right way of putting it, but the way their cuts will cash out, where if you can't wash your bottom half, you can get PIP, but if you can't wash your top half, you can't, really arbitrary distinctions that just seem obviously unjust to people. So I feel like that story isn't yet over. Let's do another aspect of this sort of Labour infighting, though. Starmer's U-turn on the winter fuel payment might improve the Prime Minister's polling, but it's bad news for Chancellor Rachel Reeves, who announced the cuts just 10 months ago. She's reportedly under increasing pressure from backbench Labour MPs, with many now questioning her political judgment. They should have done that a while ago, but we're catching up. That's good. That also might be why an interesting story made it into the papers today. A secret memo leaked to the Telegraph reveals that Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner asked the Chancellor to consider tax rises on the country's richest rather than welfare cuts before the spring statement back in April. Rayner's suggestions included a tax rise for the million people who pay the higher rate of income tax, as well as a higher corporation tax on banks. None of those made it into the spring statement, with Reeves instead choosing to cut personal independent payments and other incapacity benefits instead. A spending review next month is also likely to see further deep cuts to departmental budgets. All of that is making some Labour MPs uncomfortable. Now, what the leaking of the memo shows is a split in the government's front bench when it comes to economic policy, with Rayner, of course, laying out a more left-wing position in oppositions to Reeves's, I suppose, more austerian approach. That's got some political commentators theorising. So the iPaper's chief political commentator, Kitty Donaldson, has argued that the leaked memo shows Rayner has her eye on the leadership. That's an interesting theory, and it's one that Labour MP Diane Abbott seemed to support on Good Morning Britain with this pretty shady intervention.
Do you think that he will be Prime Minister at the time of the next general election?
I hope so.
But do you think he will be?
I hope so.
Do you think there is a better person within the Labour front bench, or indeed the party, to be Prime Minister than Keir Starmer at the
Well, there
moment?
are other people. Angela Rayner's in the papers today.
She seemed a lot more enthusiastic when she answered the third question than when she was asked the first two. Helena, I suppose in a way this sort of links back to what we've been discussing on plenty of shows recently, which is that, everyone seems to be waking up to the fact that Keir Starmer's a bit of a dud. And given that, sort of discussions about who could replace him are in a way surprisingly undeveloped. There isn't that much speculation I've seen in the press or in sort of the political commentariat about if Keir Starmer is toppled, who would sort of stand in his wake. Do you think this today is sort of Angela Rayner making a pitch? The assumption is that it's people around her who've leaked these papers. It could be, obviously that's not confirmed, but that seems to be the assumption of the commentary I've seen. And the suggestion is she's leaked this to the newspaper because when there is a leadership election, people will say, well, I don't want to vote for anyone who's implicated in the winter fuel payment cut because that was electorally damaging and also sort of I don't agree with it morally. And she wants to get out ahead of this and say, well, I was against it to begin with. Do you think she's angling for leader? Could you see that happening? Obviously there'll be lots of left-wing people that have left the Labour Party already. Wes Streeting will be hoping that all of them has left and everyone left in the Labour Party is to the right of Tony Blair. But it'll be interesting to see. How do you see this sort of playing out?
Well, I don't think that Keir Starmer is lasting to the next election at all. I think his time is basically already over. I think he's already a lame duck prime minister, which is insane to say 10 months since the last general election. But I do think that he's on his way out. I think that when you look at the opinion polls of him specifically, people hate him. And I think also what's important is that internally within the party, he's not popular. And I think that even in the PLP, even if they like him personally or think that keeping somebody who doesn't like the left at the top of the party is within their interest, I think a lot of them are also cottoning on to the fact that having somebody who is essentially being entirely in hock with Morgan McSweeney's kind of master plan for their time in government hasn't worked for them and is only making them even more unpopular. I think there was that quote, somebody saying, well, the thesis go further and faster, but it's the things that we're already doing that people hate. I think we're seeing more and more that the PLP themselves, who've been specifically selected for loyalty, by the way, by the PLP in the run-up to the election, by the McSweeney Politburo, in the run-up to the election, if these people are already speaking to the press and saying, doesn't look like it's working, then I feel like this time is up. And basically when the entire McSweeney strategy was just, well, let's just lie to everybody and hope nobody notices, I really don't think that is going to give Keir Starmer any kind of staying power. People don't like liars. They turfed at Boris Johnson. And I believe we'll see something similar with Keir Starmer eventually. They'll probably have him be the fall guy for all of the bad things that people perceive the government to have done up until now, and then they'll go for some kind of leadership election, maybe changing some rules to ensure that a left-winger is less likely to win. But I think that the PLP will eventually find a way of twisting the screws to ensure that there is at least some change at the top of the party. Because whatever they're doing now, when they've got like minus 50% government approval rating, clearly it isn't working. Now, when it comes to Angela Rayner, I think absolutely she's angling at the leadership. Remember it from Get In? I believe it was from Get In by Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire. They specifically pointed out that there was already a plan after the Hartlepool by-election in 2021, I believe it was, for Angela Rayner to try and kind of coup Keir Starmer at the top of the party. She's already had leadership ambitions before, if these stories are to be believed. She had backings of loads of groups internally within the Labour Party, backings of multiple trade unions were on side as well. She is not somebody who is kind of only thinking about these things theoretically. There is already an organised group of people behind her in the party who would immediately support a leadership spill, if there was one, for Angela Rayner against Keir Starmer. And when it comes to people like Wes Streeting, it was a really great clip from the newsagents and Lewis Goodall saying, well, actually, when you think about it, Wes Streeting isn't very popular amongst Labour members, actually, despite the fact the media love him. And I'm like, yeah, of course he isn't. No one likes Wes Streeting. And so the membership, even the ones who are left, after all the expulsions, after all of the exile, after all of the door is open that you can leave, the membership that are left, they still like Ed Miliband, they still like Angela Rayner, they still don't like people like Wes Streeting, and Rachel Reeves is one of the, and Liz Kendall as well, are some of the most hated people as far as the membership are concerned. And outside of this, when it comes to the broader scale of whether or not Labour could be electorally successful under Angela Rayner, given that a lot of the people who are leaving the Labour voting cohort in terms of how they're being polled are leaving to parties who they perceive to be more on the liberal end of the political spectrum. These people are also, when polled, show that their most favoured politician is Angela Rayner as well. So she's not just popular when it comes to the Labour membership, which is obviously very self-selecting, but when it comes to the people who voted for the Labour Party in 2024, if they wanted to bring these people back into the fold, Angela Rayner is the number one candidate who they believe would win their votes back as well. So I think that if you're a Labour Party strategist who's not in hock with the Politburo, then I think you'd be wise in backing Angela Rayner. Personally, I think that I voted for her for deputy leader, and I think her time has basically ruined her connection with the left wing of politics. But her connections to the trade unions is what's important, because they're the people who have like the power within the party up against the PLP, which members just kind of don't have. So could we see an Angela Rayner prime minister? I mean, at the very least, if we do, we'll have somebody who's actually come from a proper working class background, no son of a toolmaker. She's walked the walk and talked the talk being a carer, and that can only be a good thing. Having a woman being prime minister from a Labour Party background, from a trade union background, even if I dislike her personally and her political trajectory.
Yeah, but it probably would be Angela Rayner versus Wes Streeting, I would imagine, with the sort of left. Lots of people in the comments saying, really, Angela Rayner left wing? Obviously, it's not particularly left wing, but if of the people who's plausibly going to stand, I imagine she would probably be the left candidate, partly, as you say, because of her connections with the trade unions. I imagine Wes Streeting and being on the right. I think in part, sort of the advantage both of them have is they don't sound quite as much like robots as the current leadership. It would be interesting. I mean, they should hurry up and get rid of Keir Starmer, because I think it's over. Keir Starmer's Labour government has constantly embarrassed itself over its policy towards Gaza, and today is no different than the other 590 days since Israel's assault on the Strip began. The government has made a big announcement promising to send $5 million in aid to Gaza. $5 million. That's about £4 million. So not a lot. It's particularly pathetic when you remember that just last week the UK government defended its continuing arms sales to Israel in London's High Court, and also last week Defence Minister Maria Eagle confirmed that RAF spy flights were still surveilling Gaza while promising the UK would continue to back Israel. And what the government has done, though, is suspend trade talks with Israel over what Foreign Secretary David Lammy called the repellent extremism of some ministers in the country's government. So not over the slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians, and not over the actual actions of the Israeli military that's ground most of Gaza into rubble, but over words. Again, we're not angry at what you're doing, we're angry that you're being too open about it. And when the last 24 hours, at least 82 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by Israeli weapons. One of them was this one-day-old baby whose family home was targeted in central Gaza. Also killed in that blast were several other children. According to the Israeli military, over 115 sites have been targeted by the Air Force since Tuesday evening. In the meantime, humanitarian aid is still not getting to Palestinians in Gaza, despite a promise by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to marginally lift his 3-month blockade on the Strip last weekend. Doctors Without Borders have described the promise as, quote, a smokescreen to pretend the siege is over. Their humanitarian coordinator in Khan Yunis told reporters this. The Israeli authorities' decision to allow a ridiculously inadequate amount of aid into Gaza after months of an airtight siege signals their intention to avoid the accusation of starving people in Gaza, while in fact keeping them barely surviving. The UN has also condemned the trickle of aid getting into the Strip. They say that Israel is not allowing their staff to access the supplies, with the much-needed flour, baby food, medical equipment and pharmaceuticals still sitting in trucks on the Gaza side of the border. Even that's too much for some Israelis, though. On Wednesday, protesters tried to block even the tiniest bit of urgent supplies from entering the Strip, with some arrested by the police. One protester told Reuters why he was there.
I'm here as part of the Tzav Tesha movement, and we're here to block the aid that's going in directly to Hamas in Gaza. The only thing that was working initially, and the first deal back in November of 2023, was when we weren't feeding our enemy. Never in the history of mankind was anybody ever asked or provided or needed under any law, international law, under any morality law, to bring food and even weaponry to their enemy while hostages are being held in the Hamas dungeons. And that's what I'm here to try to stop.
No one's asking the Israelis to bring Palestinians in Gaza food. They're asking the Israelis to stop sort of killing people who do want to bring food into Gaza, right? The reason that the humanitarian organizations need Israeli permission to distribute aid is because otherwise their volunteers will get killed, like the many other humanitarian volunteers who've been killed in Gaza. So this idea, why should we give them food? No one's asking you to give them food. People are asking you to end a brutal medieval-style siege. Of course, this is the situation those protesters are trying to prolong. Maya al-Arja is just 18 months old. During the blockade, her weight has plummeted from 12 kilograms to under 7 kilograms due to acute malnutrition, chronic diarrhea, and a wheat allergy. According to her mother, Maya just lies on her stomach all day, barely able to do anything. It's not just international aid agencies sounding the alarm over the catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. A group of British surgeons working in the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis have been sending Sky News updates about conditions there. This is some of what they've seen.
Because of the blockade, there's so little stuff getting in. There's no food getting in, so people are starving. There's very little medical supplies coming in. But also the other very noticeable thing is the massive extent of destruction. I mean, Khan Yunis looks like Stalingrad.
I'm standing on the balcony of the EMT accommodation, and a really large bomb has just gone off not far to the east of us. And the ambulances here have just readied themselves to go off and pick up who knows how many casualties. So I think we've got a lot of work heading our way.
What can you say? I mean, it's horrific. Gaza has become a slaughterhouse. That's what it is. It's a slaughterhouse. Do something. Stop talking and do something.
Gaza has become a slaughterhouse. Do something. Stop talking and do something. I mean, just really, really powerful words there. And obviously what our government is doing, well, it's wrong to say our government isn't doing enough, because our government is doing too much in the sense that we're still sending arms to Israel, right? But the fact that now, I think there was a BBC headline saying that sort of Keir Starmer and David Lammy sound really angry at Israel now. Sort of like after 19 months, they sound angry at Israel now. They're still not doing anything, right? Our government has an enormous amount of power when it comes to stopping this genocide. So hearing David Lammy or Keir Starmer say, we're very upset about this, we're very cross, while they're still not doing the bare minimum, which is stopping sending arms to Israel, I think is, fairly despicable. The UK government's support for Israel is almost unwavering, even in the face of a genocide in Gaza, but it has announced one package of measures aimed at punishing Israelis who continue to occupy Palestinian land in the West Bank. That's illegal settlers, of course. And one of them is now pretty famous or infamous, thanks to Louis Theroux and his recent BBC documentary. This is the godmother of Israeli settlerism, Daniela Weiss.
Jewish settlements in Gaza is a very difficult step that demands a lot of work. You have to influence the leftist, the government, the nations of the world, using the magic system, Zionism. You redeem the land, you establish communities, you bring Jewish families, you live Jewish life, and this will bring light instead of darkness. And this is how the state of Israel was established. And this is what we want to do in Gaza.
This process of making the whole of the West Bank and Gaza Jewish, do you feel like it's moving more quickly?
As far as Judea and Samaria is concerned, so we want to move from 1 million to 2 million. So this is the next step. This is my vision. Not so complicated.
Now, that plan of Weiss has got slightly more complicated. I mean, I don't think it's really going to deter her, but the UK has now imposed sanctions on her and two other settler leaders, her organisation, Nakala, and on two illegal outposts in the West Bank. The move means that any UK assets Weiss has will be frozen. She'll be restricted from using UK financial institutions. She'll be subject to a travel ban. It's not a lot. It's pretty late, especially given Weiss has been spreading her racist ideas for decades. This is from a Haaretz interview in 2022.
People say to me, why don't you explain to the Jews in the United States what is exactly behind your thinking? I explain. But I'm laughing because the right word for it, you have to brainwash all the time. You have to say, to explain it, to live it, to cope with it. My husband says to me, why do you speak to your children all the time about Zionism, pioneers in Judea and Samaria, settling, and all my family are settlers here? Because this is the only way to continue Zionism.
I mean, if Zionism is a very expansionary project, that is the only way to continue it. And obviously, what she's indoctrinating her children to believe is that you should expel Palestinians because of their ethnicity and steal their homes, essentially. Weiss is, of course, nothing if not consistent. Here she is back in 1987.
I don't see how any person, whether Arab or of any other nationality or any other origin, finding his future here unless he fully 100% identifies with the Zionist idea. And the Zionist idea is a state for the Jewish nation. This is identifying with our tradition, with our faith, with our will to build a state for the Jews, period. And what we exactly want is a state only for the Jews. Sometimes people are afraid to say it because it sounds racism, it sounds discriminatory. Yes, if they want, they are more than welcome to identify with the Zionist idea. But if they don't want, as they express it clearly that they don't want, I don't see any reason why they should stay here. Not because we tell them don't stay here, but because they realize that it's not a place for them.
Of course, I mean, again, this is another one of those UK policies where you sort of, we're going to put some sanctions on the lady that appeared in the Louis Theroux documentary, but not on Netanyahu, right? Who has been enabling this for decades, right? If you want a guy who is responsible for the expulsion of Palestinians from their home, yeah, Daniela Weiss is like a, she's a sort of caricature of evil. I mean, but Netanyahu is also a caricature of evil. Helena, it seems to me that this is, I suppose, the UK government going for, well, I don't want to say an easy target because I mean, it's absolutely right to put sanctions on this woman, right? I don't think we should feel sorry for, they've gone for an easy target. But it's missing the point, isn't it? Sanctioning this lady and still maintaining full diplomatic relations with Israel and essentially supporting Netanyahu.
Or indeed all of the support that we have given to Israel whilst they were building illegal settlements, obviously legal under international law, the outposts were legal under Israeli law, but when Likud are in power, they let them happen. Anyway, we've been happily having diplomatic relationships with Israel whilst they engage in settler colonialism in Palestine for decades and decades and decades, right? This is obviously a fly in the ointment. As you say, good. I'm glad that we're sanctioning people like Daniela Weiss, but it does feel like we're getting government by Netflix special at this point, in the same way that we only do stuff about the post office scandal when Alan Bates has a documentary about him or a dramatization on ITV, or we only talk about the issues facing young men and boys in this country when you have adolescents on Netflix. Oh, what, Louis Theroux did a documentary about the Israeli settlers? Well, okay, well, if we sanction that one specifically that everyone saw on the telly, then suddenly people will just forget about the fact that we've been selling the weapons for the government that's been committing the genocide. We've been giving diplomatic cover for the country that's been engaging in settler colonialism and the demolishing of homes, the murdering of journalists, the stealing of land, right? At least when you've got, people like Alan Duncan, who even when the Tories were in government, he was somebody in DFID who was explicitly calling out the fact that these were explicitly land grabs, right? Got briefed against him huge amounts by CFI. And the fact that we've not had any discussion. And in fact, when we tried to have discussion, of course, from 2015 to 2019 about the reality of the decades-long relationship between the UK and Israel, where at no point did we ever think, maybe the enabling that we have of something that delegitimizes our own government's diplomatic position with states globally on a kind of a utilitarian level. If we would just want what's good for our country, for example, having us related diplomatically to what's happening in Israel is terrible, even if we find it morally objectionable as well, which of course we should. This is something that is being used to distract people, right? It's not just in terms of the diplomatic cover. We don't do any sanctions on other groups that are operating in the illegal settlements in the West Bank, do we? For example, in Rosebank oil field, there is one of the companies was given the license to drill there is a subsidiary of an Israeli oil company, which is explicitly and openly the financing of the energy infrastructure in the occupied the settlements in the occupied West Bank, right? Something that is out there enabling violations of international law. We're like, help yourself to our natural resources, right? So when it comes to government by showmanship, what's going to be look good for the cameras, what's going to poll well, what's going to be symbolic, sure, sanctioning Daniela Weiss, that's going to play very well with floating voters who've seen the Louis Theroux documentary. But in terms of our material relationship with Israel, this is decades long, has left a trail of Palestinian blood and an absolute deluge of stolen land and broken promises and violations of international law, which a couple of puny sanctions will do nothing to remedy.
Yeah, I know they did it on yesterday's show, so we're not going to sort of pour over it again, but sort of David Lammy's telling Zara Sultana, you're just asking questions for a Twitter clip from the same person whose policies towards Israel sort of consist of sounding angry, putting sanctions on the lady from the documentary, but then continuing to sell arms to the actual Israeli government, who are actually supporting the crazy lady from the documentary and who are actually committing a genocide in Gaza. So sort of like for this Labour government who only do virtue signalling to then call someone who's actually been consistent on this a virtue signaller. Of course, Zara Sultana can't do much more than sort of do a speech in Parliament and then release it as a Twitter video. She's not in government. David Lammy is. Right, so it, as a backbencher, it kind of is Zara Sultana's job to virtue signal. But David Lammy, your job is to do something. So why are you just virtue signaling? Labour on this, it's morally despicable. It's also just another example of them being completely pathetic, which is to say, oh, we'd love to do something, but we can't. Why not? Obviously, there's no reason why the UK can't stop sending arms to Israel, can't put sanctions on Israel. Right? Why not? I think that would increase their popularity, by the way. It would at least make Keir Starmer seem like he stands for something. So, I can't do it because Donald Trump doesn't want us to do it. All the leaders in the world who've stood up against Donald Trump have actually, done pretty well from it. Look at Mark Carney in Canada. Look at Albanese in Australia. So the idea that sort of like, it would be too difficult to do this, so we're just going to sort of put some sanctions on the crazy lady from the documentary. Helena, I know you want to come back on this.
It's interesting you say, obviously, that they feel like that they can't have been any more vociferous in their condemnation of Israel up to now, despite the fact, as you rightly point out, when you look at the polling nationally, when you look at what the polls look like, people really do dislike Israel and support Palestine in terms of what's happening in this conflict. They support overwhelmingly sanctions on Israel and arms embargo. These have been, and the arrest of Netanyahu in terms of the ICC arrest warrant, right? They've supported all of these things. The government has been very, very slow to act. There was a piece in The Independent that said, oh, well, the only reason why the Keir Starmer and David Lammy have been so reticent to show a little bit more kind of vociferousness in calling out Israel, and that we've got to the point where they've facilitated genocide and doing all of this too little too late, is because of Jeremy Corbyn still living rent-free in the heads of UK journalists. But of course, this shows you, again, what 2015 to 2019 was all about, and the demonization of the position that he held with regards to what was happening between Israel and Palestine. It was to get to a point to manufacture the consent to the point where we get to the place where politicians feel too scared to stop facilitating genocide because they might get criticized in the way Jeremy Corbyn got criticized from 2015 to 2019. Just openly, essentially, giving the game away by making this comparison. Well, Keir Starmer and David Lammy, they would do things, but they don't want to be compared to Jeremy Corbyn. I'm just like, well, that was what the consent was being manufactured for. So there was no possibility of UK politicians feeling safe to actually take a position that was anti-Israel, lest they be condemned by the press.
Nothing terrifies political leaders more than inflation. It was rising prices under the Biden presidency that gave Donald Trump back his keys to the White House. And now his own tariffs look likely to hike inflation. Again, Trump is lashing out. In response to Walmart saying they'd have to hike prices in response to tariffs, the president has posted this: Walmart should stop trying to blame tariffs as the reason for raising prices throughout the chain. Walmart made billions of dollars last year, far more than expected. Between Walmart and China, they should, as is said, eat the tariffs and not charge valued customers anything. I'll be watching, and so will your customers. Whether Walmart will eat the tariffs is yet to be seen. Inflation is currently only 2.3% in the United States, the lowest since early 2021. So this inflation, which Donald Trump is clearly terrified of, hasn't quite arrived yet. The UK, though, hasn't been so lucky, driven by hikes in gas, electricity and water bills. Inflation here has just hit 3.5%. Now, that's the highest it's been in more than a year. So what is the future of inflation across the West? Will the cost of living crisis abate or intensify? And how many more governments will be felled by the scourge of rising prices? Someone well placed to answer that question is Mark Blyth, who has co-written a new book called Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers. Mark is Professor of International Economics at Brown University. We covered so much in this interview, including whether Trump's tariffs had a point, why the UK government is failing so badly on so many fronts, and whether the West is cooked compared to China. But I started by asking him why politicians are so obsessed with the inflation rate.
I think part of it's a kind of muscle memory from university. They all did an econ course at one point and were told that the 70s was literally hell on earth. And if you replicate the 70s and unions get uppity and you'll have wage price spirals and it's all death, which none of which actually has anything to do with the inflations that we're getting at the moment, which are all supply shock driven. The real reason they hurt is because at its simplest, inflation is a tax on consumption. And when you have generated extraordinarily unequal societies, what it means is your bottom 60% doesn't have very much money. Therefore, when inflation goes up by, let's say, 5%, if you're spending 60, 70% of your income on consumption goods, that's a real hit. And it's a real hit to millions of people. Conversely, if you're at the other end of the income distribution and you've bought your own house, you've got shares, for example, you don't worry about inflation at all, not just because that share of your consumption is much smaller, but because you can actually benefit from inflationary forces. For example, if you own oil stocks when there's an oil shock. So it's this asymmetry across the income distribution that means that so many people get hurt disproportionately that politicians really fear it.
Is there also an upside to inflation, though? So we'll talk about the UK in a moment, but I know we've got inflation of 3.5%. That was higher than people expected. But actually, wage growth is 5%, which, I mean, should mean that on average, people's wages are rising. And my understanding was also that sort of one of the big groups that get hit by inflation are creditors, so people who've given out loans. So I thought there was also sort of an argument that sort of high inflation, so long as it comes with increased wages, is actually better for people at the lower end of the wage spectrum. I mean, is there something to that?
There is something to that. I mean, it depends on how bad the income skew is, right? If you're basically on 25,000 quid and you live in a major city and you're spending 70% of your income on consumption goods, namely food, fuel, housing, etc., you don't have much. So a little bit more can send you over the edge. Second thing is the debt thing. It's called the Fisher channel, right? Why does this work? Well, ultimately because, if your wages go up and it's higher than the rate of inflation, you're obviously winning. But also if you've got fixed rate debt, then your nominal amount goes up, but ultimately the real value of what you're paying is paying back because inflation's eating away at it. This is why baby boomers all have huge houses, right? They got like that payoff in the 70s. The economy's structured much differently now. Most loans are variable rates, you can adjust them, etc. Banks are really good at not eating the costs of this. So, for example, during the inflationary period of the past couple of years, no one's savings rate on their savings account went up anywhere near the underlying rate of inflation. So the pass-through that you would get from higher interest rates doesn't work. So overall, it's net regressive, even if there are kind of like Fisher channel effects, which leads to this kind of cheapening of debt.
Let's talk about the UK inflation rate. I mean, it's higher here than it is in the rest of Europe or in the United States. As I said earlier, 3.5%. What explains that? I know sort of the headline is that this is because we've got higher bills than we had before, but why have we got higher bills than Europe or the United States? What explains what's special about us Brits?
It's a British thing. You reset them all at once. And basically your water bill jumps up at a certain time of year, your gas bill jumps up at a certain time, and they all hit at once. So it's a kind of classic sort of, you're getting this one-time shock. Does that lead to higher inflation structurally, or does it dissipate? Open question. Is inflation at 3.5% really that high? Only if you think that 2% was normal. And if you look at over a longer period of history, 2% would have been something that they would have dreamed of having in the 60s or the 1970s. We had this extraordinary period of basically from the late 90s through until the financial crisis. And then from the financial crisis onward of negative real rates and deflation rather than inflation. So we got used to this period of incredibly low rates. Given the fact that the inflations that caused the forces that caused the inflationary problems of the past couple of years are largely supply shocks stemming from the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and then companies taking advantage of this in concentrated markets. Is it really that much of a shock that it's 3.5%? It's not.
So should we just get used to that? Is that sort of your argument, that sort of if we get used to 3.5% instead of 2%, then we should just be able to get used to this as they did in the 60s?
Right, but in the 60s, you had a much more equalitarian income distribution. So basically, you had less people at the bottom end of the tail that were susceptible to having a really nasty inflation shock. The costs of it were actually much less. You had concentrated interest in the middle. You had unions that basically could bargain for their share of productivity. None of that stuff applies now, which was why I find looking at the labour market for inflationary forces in Britain, where you've got part-time contracting, a large gig economy, nobody's in a union, the notion that wages are going to rise faster than prices. The only reason you've got 6% on wage increase for a couple of years was because prior to that, they were stagnant for forever. It's not even close to catching up where it would be if you just not followed out the trend. It's yes, get used to it, but that's going to be hard for large segments of the population. Second thing is, if you think about the long-term drivers of this stuff, geopolitical stuff, let's say decoupling from economies, tariffs, etc. All of these things are kind of policy-induced supply shocks. And if you think about tariffs in particular in the US, it's designed to raise prices. That's what it does. No matter the fudge on this, you want things to be more expensive so that firms come home to manufacture there because it's cheaper to do that. Higher prices are written into the script.
I understand that. I understand why tariffs would lead to higher prices. I suppose, is it surprising that still hasn't been sort of borne out in the inflation figures? Because I think inflation is still lower in the United States, and it's been for quite a while. So I think some people were expecting as soon as those tariffs come into effect, then you would see a spike in inflation. But that hasn't happened yet. Is it just that we sort of haven't waited long enough for this to filter through to consumers?
You got to wait till you run out of stuff. I mean, once you start seeing shortages because 1/3 of the traffic that usually comes from China didn't show up, and now everyone's trying to restock with reduced inventories, just give it time, it'll filter through. Is it going to be huge? That's probably not going to be huge. I mean, in 2016, when Trump came in the first time and put up tariffs, loads of people were saying, it was going to be huge inflation from tariffs. And there really wasn't. because the exchange rate of the people who are sending you this stuff and also the profit margins of those firms, they can take a hit, they can accommodate, they still want to be in the market. And when it was the crazy tariffs of April 2nd, what set the markets off was nobody's going to be able to absorb this. Now you've got 30% on China and 10% on the rest of the world. You can absorb that more, but is that where it stays? This whole thing's very quixotic. We don't know where it's going to go.
You sort of talked about geopolitical shifts there. As far as I understand it, China doesn't have high inflation. If anything, they've got a bit of a deflationary economy. It seems to be principally the West where we landed with sort of stagnant growth, stagnant wages, and also in inflation. I mean, is the West cooked, for want of a better word?
Well, they do have structurally low growth, and part of the reason for this is the way that we adapted to sort of the 70s was through globalization. And particularly for Europe as a whole, not so much the United Kingdom, which actually tends to have slightly higher growth, is the fact that they've started since 2012 being an exporter, net exporter against the rest of the world. If you're a net exporter, what do you want? You want to have a relatively cheap currency. You want to suppress consumption at home. You don't want people going out and partying and having real wage increases. You want to have it slow and steady. And that way your exports maintain their price competitiveness. So it's kind of written into the script. That's the downside for the export economies. For countries like the United Kingdom, on the other side, to a certain extent, our bonanza was unlimited exports without having an exchange rate crisis. And it seems that the Americans have decided that the cost of that, which is hollowing out large parts of your economy, is not worth paying, and that we're going to turn against that. But the cost of turning against that is going to be higher prices, so coming from these shocks. So, maybe that system that we got used to is not going to be around much longer.
What should the UK government be doing?
A hell of a lot more than it is now across every bloody sector I can think of. They seem to be absolutely terrified of doing anything and completely in the thrall of whatever the Bank of England and the Treasury tell them. The job of the Treasury is not to spend any money, and the job of the Bank of England is to tell the Treasury why they can't spend any money. So if you don't actually have a Labour Party that's willing to say, hey, lads, we're going to do something different and stick to it, you get what you've got just now. So, I mean, where do you want to start with what they should be doing? I mean, for me, start with taking the Town and County Planning Act of 1946, binning it, starting again and start building 100 to 150,000 houses a year. Do that through local authorities, keep it on the state's balance sheet. You borrow at 4%, you make 5% on the house, you're making 1% net. That 1% net means you've got an asset. That asset stays on the government's books and becomes an asset that reduces the overall stock of debt. If you do housing, you have to do skills. You could reinvigorate the tech colleges that have been allowed to atrophy. You need HVAC people, you need plumbers, you need sparkies, the whole lot, all of which are actually great jobs for green industries going forward. Once you do housing, you do labour mobility. Once you do labour mobility, you get away from the London bubble. You can actually invest in other areas. There's so much that could be done, and it's so simple. And they just seem absolutely terrified of opening up the biscuit tin and spending any money.
That's really interesting. And so you think that should be done by borrowing more instead of tax rises on the wealthy? Or sort of what's your take on that? I suppose if they're building a house, they get an asset at the end of it, so they can say it is, yes, we have borrowed a load of money, but we've got this asset at the end of it, a bit like when you sort of buy a house with a mortgage. What's your take? Are you saying they should borrow more to do this?
I'm saying if they need to borrow and they have a coherent borrowing plan, then given the fact that the American bond market has been severely impacted by Trump's behavior, as you can see in the yields, sterling acts as a safe asset alternative. If you've got a credible plan for why you're doing this, why it's going to lead to growth, all bond markets care about is they want to know they're going to get paid back. If you have a credible story about how they're going to get paid back, they'll allow you room to borrow. It's really that simple. And the government is scared of its own shadow and has taken exactly the long lessons from the Liz Truss episode, which is that if you do anything, the bond market will freak out. And that's simply not the case. Also, if you want to tax the wealthy as well, and you can do that without them moving their assets abroad, do that too. But at the end of the day, we're doing this to build assets. It's totally different than doing it for consumption.
If you enjoyed hearing from Mark Blyth, well, we want to bring you more interviews like that. Big thinkers really grappling with the hard questions. At Novara Media, we're committed to challenging the low information slop the mainstream media churns out. Instead, we want to bring you rich, nutritious, fact-based analysis. If you want to see more of that, then please support Novara Media from as little as 1 hour's wage per month, or even less. I mean, for as little as £1 a month. Whatever you can afford, you can sign up at www.novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description box below. Excellent work takes time and a lot of effort, and we can't do it without you. Donald Trump has announced plans for a new big boy toy to show off to the world.
In the campaign, I promised the American people that I would build a cutting-edge missile defense shield to protect our homeland from the threat of foreign missile attack. And that's what we're doing. Today, I'm pleased to announce that we have officially selected an architecture for this state-of-the-art system that will deploy next-generation technologies across the land, sea, and space, including space-based sensors and interceptors. And Canada has called us, and they want to be a part of it. So we'll be talking to them. They want to have protection also. So as usual, we help Canada do the best we can. This design for the Golden Dome will integrate with our existing defense capabilities and should be fully operational before the end of my term. So we'll have it done in about 3 years. Once fully constructed, the Golden Dome will be capable of intercepting missiles even if they are launched from other sides of the world and even if they are launched from space. And we will have the best system ever built.
The best system ever. The Golden Dome is Trump's version of Israel's Iron Dome, or his imagined version, I suppose. Israel's Iron Dome uses surface-to-air missiles to knock incoming rockets out of the sky. Trump, though, wants his Golden Dome to knock out incoming missiles from space. Now, that would require a network of satellites for detection and presumably some armed spacecraft to shoot down any intercontinental weaponry. Apparently, this could be done with lasers. Trump has announced an initial $25 billion for the project, and he said it's expected in total to be a $175 billion investment. So does it make any sense at all? Well, expert analysis is mixed. This was Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution. I'm speaking to Deutsche Welle.
Donald Trump says a lot of things that are half crazy, but the overall argument here is worth taking seriously because, as you probably know, we already have a bit of a national missile defense. It's based primarily in Alaska and California, designed primarily against a North Korean ICBM threat, and now roughly 15 years old. And we're trying to upgrade that, but it's not particularly capable against Iran if they ever develop a nuclear capable missile. It's not capable against launches from the East in general. And if you're worried about an accidental launch or a coercive threat with somebody saying we'll launch 1 or 2 missiles at you if you don't do X, Y, or Z, this kind of a system has a certain logic. What does not have a logic is believing you could actually provide an airtight coverage of the whole country against any and all missile attacks, including all-out attacks from Russia or China. And if President Trump chases that dream, it may be a little more technologically plausible than under Ronald Reagan's Star Wars vision, but it's going to be in excess of trillions of dollars in ultimate expense and still probably not be anywhere near a perfect protection.
Of course, if the US does embark on a multiple trillion-dollar project involving satellites in space, one man above all else could be set to receive a windfall. In fact, back in April, Reuters reported that Elon Musk's SpaceX was the frontrunner to build Trump's Golden Dome missile shield. That's not especially surprising. As well as Musk being Trump's biggest backer, his company is the world leader in launching satellites. Since 2019, SpaceX has launched more than 6,400 Starlink satellites, which now account for around 3/4 of all active satellites in space. To say this presents a conflict of interest, though, would be an understatement of stratospheric proportions. And if this works out for Musk, he could end up, not only with more cash, but vastly more power. This is from the Reuters piece. In an unusual twist, SpaceX has proposed setting up its role in Golden Dome as a subscription service in which the government would pay for access to technology rather than own the system outright. The subscription model, which has not been previously reported, could skirt some Pentagon procurement protocols, allowing the system to be rolled out faster, the two sources said. While the approach would not violate any rules, the government may then be locked into a subscription and lose control over its ongoing development and pricing, they added. Some Pentagon officials have expressed concerns internally about relying on the subscription-based model for any part of the Golden Dome, two sources told Reuters. Such an arrangement would be unusual for such a large and critical defense program. So this is crazy, right? Obviously, the conflict of interest here is enormous. You've got someone who's the biggest backer of Donald Trump who is in line to get billions, potentially trillions of dollars in government money to build a defense system. But as I said earlier, there's also a strange situation, which it is hard to deny in a way, that Elon Musk and SpaceX would be well placed to do this kind of project. They are, far ahead of anyone else putting satellites in space. But the idea, that's not to say I think it's a good idea, right? But the idea that this would be a subscription service, so like Amazon Prime, and you know what it's like being part of a subscription service? They just sort of email you every now and again saying, oh, we've decided to put up our prices by £2.50 this year, or in this case, by £4 billion a month this year, whatever. The idea that the US government could be renting its satellite defense system from Elon Musk, which I suppose also implies, because obviously it doesn't work out for Elon Musk if it's a subscription service, if the US is the only potential customer. It seems as if if the US is renting it from Elon Musk and then China offers a bit more money, or if the US says we can't afford this anymore, then Elon Musk says, well, I'll have to sell it to someone else then. Like, this is insane that this would be a subscription-based model like Amazon Prime, like Spotify Premium, I suppose like X Premium, right? Which doesn't seem to function particularly well. And maybe this will just be on X, the app for everything, which includes missile domes. And perhaps to create a tiny illusion of distance from the White House, because this is so obviously corrupt, Musk has recently announced his intention to step back from the day-to-day running of Trump's Department for Government Efficiency. And in an interview with Bloomberg this week, he suggested he'd step back from political funding as well.
I think in terms of political spending, I'm going to do a lot less in the future.
And why is that?
I think I've done enough.
Is it because of blowback?
Well, if I see a reason to do political spending in the future, I will do it. I do not currently see a reason.
Helena, what do you think of the idea of the United States renting a missile system from Elon Musk?
I feel like if you typed into DeepSeek, can you give me like a parody policy to satirize the collapse of neoliberalism in a kind of most succinct manner possible? This is exactly the kind of policy that it would spit out from the AI system, of course, that it is, which it's just incredible to me. It's incredible to me. Like, you've got all the worst parts of platform capitalism, of being essentially entirely at the mercy of the kind of the feudalists who own kind of the actual capital itself, being able to extract all of this from the government, having privatized all of the gains and socialized all of the losses, and not just for anything that's like potentially at least strategically important, something that is entirely, as far as I can see, a white elephant, like a giant white elephant. Can you have universal healthcare in America? No, in fact, we're going to cut a bunch of things from Medicare and Medicaid. But what we can give you is this missile defense project for a threat that doesn't exist right now anyway, is a copy of a missile defense system from a completely different area of the world, from a country of a completely different size, defending against a completely different kind of attack. Right? Remember, the Iron Dome is there to protect against the Qassam rocket, ones which are so makeshift the Israeli government decided to block cookies from going into Gaza in case they were used to make rocket fuel, right? And they're wanting to copy the same kind of format to try and protect America from ICBMs. And as has been pointed out already, the idea they could get unilateral coverage over the entirety of the United States, and of course, they probably want to have all of its overseas territory as well, is quite frankly for the birds. And anyway, like, who is attacking America, especially since they already have levels of conventional missile interception anyway? All this stands to reason that it's one big corrupt project to funnel money out of what could be going into public services that Elon Musk has cut, funnily enough, into both his pockets and, of course, the pockets of defense contractors like Lockheed Martin. When it comes to Donald Trump, I think he's probably fully sold on the idea this is going to be some grand project to protect what he described as the homeland. Interesting how much kind of Israeli verbiage is kind of seeped into these kinds of projects that he's kind of copying here. America isn't a homeland. It's a settler colonial state, right? I guess Israel is too, but they perceive it to be a homeland, at least on ethnic grounds. Like, America is entirely made up of a patchwork of different things, but regardless. I saw Lockheed Martin, that's another potential contractor for this, talk about this in the same terms, as try just defense of the homeland. Do they have any actual kind of details on what any of their role in this would be? No, it was all just kind of marketing guff on their website about the announcement of the Golden Dome project, which, as far as Trump is concerned, as I said, I think he genuinely believes in the project. As far as the rest of the Republican Party are concerned, I fully believe that all of this is just yet another scheme to funnel public money into the pockets of defense contractors, because at the end of the day, they're the people who hold the real political power. One last thing I would say, when it comes to Elon Musk, sure, I think there is some level to which he's wanting to step back so that the corruption isn't very open. But also from the stories that we've heard already, people in the Republican government hate Elon Musk. They find him irritating. And he's also bad for them politically. Remember, he sunk all of that money into the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, and they did worse after he put all that in. All the stuff that he's done, again, the Republicans already wanted to do, like cut a bunch of government services, all part of the Project 2025 plan, right? He's taken all of the flack for all of the Doge cuts that were part of the Republican project, but he's the face of it. So really, it's a way of trying to give the Republicans plausible deniability and say, oh, no, all of those cuts that you hate, that was all Elon Musk's problem. He's gone now. Now you can just love us the fact we're giving you this missile defense project, which as far as I can see, serves no real purpose at all.
Yeah. I mean, someone did say in the comments that aren't we renting our Trident program, which I think there is a degree of that. But at least it's from a nation state, not just from a random billionaire. Thanks for joining me, Helena. It's been very enjoyable and interesting to spend the evening with you.
I just noticed that we've both turned up essentially wearing the same thing. One of us should have changed beforehand. Just noticed that.
Disaster. The worst thing that could have happened. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.